Hello, everyone. We're just getting everyone in from the waiting room. While we do that, we're just going to put a question in the chat. If you want to take the time to answer that, you can. Okay. And while we continue to get everyone in, I just want to say hello and welcome. I'm Lindsay Randall, and today the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the Massachusetts Historic Commission, and the Preservation Massachusetts are excited to welcome all of you to the Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition, the EMHCC, meeting on integrating accessory dwelling units, also referred to as ADUs, in historic districts. With the passage of the Affordable Homes Act in August 2024, ADUs are now allowed by right in single-family zoning districts in all communities in the Commonwealth. The Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, EOHLC, has issued regulations on January 31st, and the law went into effect on February 2nd. And today we're here to learn more about the law and how historic preservation advocates can support the creation of new homes while maintaining what they value about their communities. And we have three fantastic speakers with us today who will do just that. So we're going to start with Gwendolyn Helen Sands from MAPC, who will provide an overview of the ADU law and EOHLC regulations. And we'll introduce model ADU zoning that MAPC has developed in partnership with EOHLC and the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, or MHP. We also have Jim O'Connell, a historian and author of The Hub's Metropolis, he will provide historical context on how the greater Boston region has housed people over time. And then we have VJ Joyce from the city of Salem, who will present their approach to reviewing ADUs on properties under the jurisdiction of the Salem Historic Commission, where he is the chair. And during our presentations, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of all three presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. And yes, the meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the MAPC YouTube page and posted to the EMHCC page on the MAPC website. So thank you for all being here, and let's dive into the interesting world of ADUs. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrea Harris-Long from MAPC, our Director of Land Use, to share some comments about that.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to hear about accessory dwelling units and how they can support local historic preservation goals. I think that Lindsay and team have lined up a great panel today to talk about all of the different resources, and I'm especially looking forward to hearing about the historic context as a history fan myself. As Lindsay mentioned, MAPC has long been really supportive of accessory dwelling units as one way to help address our housing crisis. It's a great way to expand housing choices in communities at an appropriate kind of scale whenever there's space in larger lots that can accommodate an accessory dwelling unit. It's a great way to offer a new housing choice in communities. We, as Lindsay mentioned, have been working really closely with the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities and Mass Housing Partnership to help our cities and towns implement this law. Gwendolyn will be talking about the model ADU zoning that we have helped develop, and that's now live on the EOHLC website. So hopefully folks have had a chance to take a look before today. And as I think most of you know, ADUs are not really a new concept. It's something that we've long had in our communities. They're part of our neighborhood fabric already, and it's long been part of a traditional sort of settlement pattern across many of our communities. And so I'm really excited to have the space this morning to talk about how ADUs can support historic preservation in a variety of ways. Some of the things that we've been talking about kind of in the MAPC office is how ADUs can better facilitate restoration of older outbuildings that might be historic and otherwise underutilized. They're a great way to provide homeowners with historic properties with additional income to help with the upkeep and maintenance of those properties. And then, as you know, accessory dwelling units can take a lot of different shapes and forms. And so it's really important to think about the different ways that ADUs can be designed to fit within the historic streetscape. And I'm looking forward to hearing maybe VJ talk a little bit about that in Salem. We hope that this is a really helpful program for you all, and you can come away thinking about new ways that ADUs can help address kind of your local preservation goals and also help address our housing crisis here in Massachusetts. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the panelists, and thanks again for everyone joining, and we look forward to the program.
Thank you, Andrea. Gwendolyn, we will turn it over to you to give the context of what is this law and what is the model bylaw and things like that.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. And Andrea, I'm going to share my screen. I also just dropped in the chat a link to the ADU regulations themselves and the ADU model zoning so that everyone can take a look at those and you can reference them as I go if that's helpful. Okay. I am going to present. All right. Everyone can see my screen. Good. Cool. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Gwendolyn Helen Sands. I'm a housing planner here at MEPC, and I've been working on studying ADUs and this new law in Massachusetts the past couple of months. So I'm really excited to be chatting with you all today about sort of the basics of the law, and then I'll dive a little bit into how it works in historic districts. So, as many of you know, the Affordable Homes Act was passed in August of 2024, and part of the Affordable Homes Act was this provision for ADUs to be allowed by right in the state of Massachusetts. So this was signed in August 6th, but it went into effect in February. So I'll talk more about that in a second. Yeah, so the law that allowed ADUs by right in the state went into effect on February 2nd in 2025. This means that any municipal ADU zoning that is not consistent with the state ADU law will no longer be enforceable. But I just want to highlight, as we've been trying to highlight as we go, and talk about this, that it's different from 3A or the MBTA communities, and that does not require you to update your ADU bylaw or ordinance, or to even have an ADU bylaw or ordinance in every municipality. It just means that you can't enforce anything that's non-compliant. But the tools that we're talking about today are ways to help you write an ADU bylaw or ordinance that is compliant with the state law and can make it easier for your residents to build ADUs. So what does it mean that ADUs are by right in Massachusetts? It means that every municipality must allow ADUs in single-family zoning districts in the state, and they must allow all types of ADUs. That's part of the provision. So this includes attached, internal, detached, and above garage ADUs. So just highlighting these here in the photo. So it can be, an ADU can be like an addition in this attached version. Internal can be like, often it's thought of in your basement or your attic, but you're converting a space that already exists in your main primary dwelling. Or a detached is sort of the traditional ADU that we often think of a cottage in your backyard or a small studio. And then above garage is sort of an interesting one to think about, especially in historic contexts. If you have a carriage house or other accessory dwellings or accessory buildings like that, it can be a great way to convert to an ADU or add an ADU. We just like to highlight why are ADUs important? Why did the state legalize them? They're beneficial because they are a way to create modestly priced housing. They're often small housing units, therefore hopefully are more affordable than a lot of our larger units in Massachusetts. They increase housing supply in residential areas through low impact infill. So in these single family residential zoning neighborhoods that are often thought of to be at capacity, can't be zoned to have more housing, they add in a little bit more housing. They also create housing options for small households. It can be for seniors, so it could be for people to house one of their parents, or young adults, people who are just getting started living on their own. It's also a great way for the homeowner to generate supplemental income. So I'm going to dive now into the ADU regulations themselves. They can be a little tricky, so happy to answer questions at the end. I think after all the speakers, we'll answer some questions. Yeah, so when the state legalized ADUs by right, they created this new term of protected use ADUs. So any ADU that is protected by right by the state is a protected use ADU. what this means is it fits the state definition, which I'll go through here. This is the state's definition of a protected use ADU. So it's a self-contained housing unit, either attached, detached, or internal, as we talked about, inclusive of sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities. It must be on the same lot as a principal dwelling. And it is subject to these other applicable dimensional and parking requirements. A big requirement is that it maintains a separate entrance. This can be through an internal hallway or from outside, but it must have a separate entrance for the residents. The big one here that makes this a specific state definition is that they define the size of the ADU as not larger in gross floor area than half of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. So this means that if you have a primary dwelling that's 1,600 square feet of gross floor area, you can only have an 800 square foot ADU on that property, because that's half of 1,600. 900 square feet is the max, so you cannot have a protected use ADU that's bigger than 900 square feet. And then you can, depending on the municipality, you're allowed to subject ADUs to additional restrictions as may be imposed by the municipality. And we'll talk about what the limitations are there. There are certain things that municipalities can and cannot impose on these ADUs. So it's a little confusing sometimes that there is this protected use ADU definition, and I just want to highlight that municipalities are required to allow these protected use ADUs by right, one per lot in qualifying areas. But you can also allow non-protected use ADUs. So like, for example, the easiest example here is if you want to allow an ADU that is over 900 square feet, municipalities are able to allow that. It just will not be a protected use ADU, and they're regulated a little bit differently. That's something we dive into in our model zoning document, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. So if you have confusions there or want to know more about that, we have resources for you. So prohibited regulations. In the state regulations, they talk about certain things that you are not allowed to control with ADUs or protected use ADUs specifically. One is owner occupancy requirements. This is a big one that a lot of municipalities had in there who had existing ADU bylaws. You're no longer allowed to require that the person who lives in the ADU is related to or is the owner or any sort of relationship with the owner of the primary dwelling. For parking requirements, you can require one on or off-street parking space for an ADU as long as the lot is outside of a half-mile radius from a transit station. The regulation does define what a transit station is. So that's clear. It does include all bus stops. Any additional parking for lots within that half-mile radius of a transit station is not allowed. So those are pretty specific requirements there. You're not allowed to have any use or occupancy restrictions of an ADU. You're not allowed to have a quota or limit or number of the protected use ADUs within your municipality or within a specific zoning district. And you're not allowed to have any requirements around ADU type. Like we talked about, you have to allow attached, detached, and internal ADUs. So a little bit about historic districts. So the regulations do say that you're allowed to establish design standards and apply them to ADUs that are within historic districts. They have this very specific definition of design standards that I want to highlight. So the state within the ADU regulations defines design standards as clear, measurable, and objective provisions of zoning or general ordinances or bylaws which are made applicable to the exterior design of and use of materials for an ADU. And then later on in the regulations, the second paragraph, they go on to say that municipalities may establish design standards and dimensional standards for protected use ADUs located in a historic district that are more restrictive or different from what is required for a single-family residential dwelling or principal dwelling in the single-family residential zoning district. So basically, they're saying here that you can apply design standards to an ADU. It must be applied when it's within a historic district. What they're saying here about more restrictive is that it can be applied more restrictive for a single family that is in that same zoning district, but not within that historic district, if that makes sense. But again, I want to highlight here that they say measurable and objective provisions must be applied through design standards. So this means that any design standard, such as something that says like an ADU must be within the architectural character of the neighborhood or fit within the architectural character of the neighborhood, because that's a subjective provision that cannot be applied to an ADU. So measurable provisions can be things like window size or roof angles or sometimes materials as well, but they have to be really specific standards that are measurable and objective. So that's sort of a difference here in how they may apply to ADUs. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to talk about the ADU model zoning, which, as Lindsay mentioned, is a resource that we've been working on with the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, as well as MHP, to be a resource for municipal planners to understand how to create zoning that goes with the state statute and regulations. So this zoning document, which again, I dropped the link to this in the chat, so if you want to look at it as I go, it's there for you. So the document provides model zoning and guidance for municipalities to regulate ADUs in accordance with the Massachusetts state statute and regulations. There are resources for both if you're updating existing zoning or if you're creating new zoning and you do not have ADU zoning. And we outline how municipalities can define and administer zoning for protected use ADUs, as well as other types of ADUs that I mentioned. For example, those larger ADUs, or if you want to allow additional types of ADUs on top of the protected use ADUs, we talk about how to do that in the model zoning. And then we suggest different approaches for different situations. So it's not meant to be a one-size-fit-all tool. It's really meant to be a starting point. As we know, municipalities in Massachusetts are all very different and have different needs. So it's meant to sort of have that flexibility so that planners can think about what their community needs when it comes to ADUs and adapt this zoning appropriately. The contents of the model zoning include an annotated version of the model zoning with commentary. So we have our model zoning text, and then we'll have annotations that are broken into do, proceed with caution, and don't. So these are things that we say, let me think of an example. So like with parking, we could say do, consider if you are outside of the half-mile radius from a transit station, do you want to include one parking space? You can include that parking minimum. Proceed with caution. It might be like, consider how much street parking you already have. Do you have enough to handle ADUs? Sort of thinking about your capacity already there. And don't is you cannot require parking within a half-mile of the transit station. So sort of laying out what you're not allowed to do within the regulations, what you can consider, and maybe some areas the proceed with caution is some things might be relevant for some communities or not for others, or for some places in your community and not for other places. We have the text of our model zoning in italics to show that it's that example text. And then we have a lot of spaces where we have brackets, and this is where it's really meant to be malleable, changeable for different communities. So we might put in some sample text, but the brackets are there to say, this is not us saying exactly how you should do it, but it's just an example. Think about what would apply to your community. Then the second part here is the clean version without those annotations, just the model zoning written out. And then we have two appendices at the end, and these are actually going to be some of the most helpful ones in this context. So the first one is a checklist for municipal planners. This really walks you through how to think about writing your model zoning. Or it will just be your zoning in that context. I'm going to show this on the next slide so we can look at that a little bit more deeply. And then the second appendix is design standards for historic districts as it applies to ADUs. And there we have that same model of, we have our model zoning text, we have our do, don't proceed with caution. It's in an appendix because it's a lot more flexible than we did for the rest of the model zoning, because I'm sure, as all of you know, historic districts really vary from not even just municipality to municipality, but district to district. So that's an area where we didn't want to be too prescriptive in the text, and we gave sort of like a general outline to get you started, but that's really going to be different for each community, and you'll really have to think about each district, how those standards might apply. This is our checklist for municipal planners. I know the text is really small here, but just sort of wanted to show what we're thinking through in this list. And it shows the big categories that we have in terms of the model zoning. So the purpose is a big one, outlining why you're doing the model zoning and why it's important. Definitions, really important. So that's clear what you're talking about the whole time. Regulations, this is where really making sure that ADUs are permitted by right, and that's specified. And then some other instances of where they are and are not allowed. One thing to note here that I think is important also in this historical district context is that ADUs are required to be allowed by right on existing non-conforming lots or with existing non-conforming primary dwellings. So that's something that's outlined in the regulations as well. And then it goes through all the prohibited regulations and unreasonable regulations, making sure that municipalities are not overstepping in putting these specific regulations on ADUs. So this is, again, attached in that document that I linked at the end in the appendix. And then I'm just going to end on some helpful resources here, and I'll put some of these links in the chat as well. Specifically, the EUHLC ADU resource page is really helpful, and the MAPC resource page that we've built out. Both of these have a recording of the webinar we gave just 2 weeks ago that goes in really in depth on this model zoning document. So if you want all the details of that and how it works, we walk through it step by step. There's a recording of that there. There's also the slides from that webinar if those are helpful to you. And then there's the model zoning itself. AARP has some great ADU resources. And then the Boston ADU guidebook, specific to Boston, but they have some really great examples of ADU plans and how to, some like architectural examples of ADUs, which I think could be really great in this context as well. And then the MAPC Living Little resource is great, just looking at smaller living spaces and designing those. Okay, so that's it for me, and I'm gonna hand it back to Lindsay.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. That was awesome. I really, really appreciate that. Now we're going to turn it over to Jim O'Connell to share about the sort of historical context of ADUs. So Jim.
Okay. Okay, it's very nice of you to have me. I hope that I can get people to think a bit creatively about housing and housing in their communities and how it can fit with historic character. It's something which I'm quite interested in. So let me get into it. I know that Gwendolyn has made a very solid presentation of the new law and how it affects our communities. I just want to point out that it's part of a broad strategy by the state to create a lot of new housing units. The state estimates that it will need 220,000 additional units over the next decade, and in a lot of it being created in a lot of different ways. Certainly, probably the way that the most new units will be created will be through building multi-family units. But we'll take a look at that. So she's pretty much given the introduction here. I just kind of put it up here again. ADUs can be attached or detached. There are no relative residency restrictions. Towns can prohibit them from being used as Airbnbs. So there are a lot of different things. You think something so simple would be simple to execute, but there are various issues that go with it. So let me go with this. And there are going to be two approaches that I'm going to be talking about in terms of thinking about housing and how it can take in more than one household, if you will. One is structural, and the other one is the organization of the space within. So let's take a look here at our houses. Now, this is traditional vernacular houses, Cape Cod, but in fact, I lived in Yarmouth for a while. This throughout the state, you have vernacular houses from 18th, 19th century, whatever. Here's just the classic example, the half cape. Okay, you could kind of take a look at that. You've got the front door, two windows on the side, the three-quarter cape with one window on the second side, and then the full cape. So that's okay. That's kind of classic. How you could just add to a house as the household expands or there's more prosperity or whatever. Here are some other examples from today, how you could do extensions or L's, whatever you want to call them, adding them to the more traditional Cape Cod house. And we have this all kinds of houses, doesn't have to be a Cape Cod house, all across our state. And then go to a completely different thing. I walk all the time, not just in my community. I live in Newton, but communities across greater Boston. And my wife and I would just like to look at the houses. And if you look at these big houses, and so many of our communities have, a good number of these Victorians, you say, I know what the architectural style is, but how many people live there? How do they keep this house going? And you had extended families. It's pretty much the idea of the nuclear family is something which really solidifies only after World War II. Before that time, you had extended families living together. You had multiple generations, grandparents, maiden aunts, nephews, just all kinds of people being brought into the household. And to maintain houses of this size, certainly up through World War I, you had servants, you had help, cooks, you might have a driver, different people who would take care of the house. If you were, these are tend to be more upper middle class houses. But these were, you had multiple generations living in houses like this. And then here we are, just again from Newton, little shots that I've taken. And these are all these carriage houses. Now, I don't know how many of these we have scattered throughout the state, where you would have a good sized carriage house or garage, but a lot of them can be added to or turned into an accessory dwelling unit. You can see on the right-hand side, the top one, the unit is attached. The main unit is, in between, and then the others are separate. So this here, accessory dwelling units, this is kind of a classic approach to three-deckers, which we have in abundance in New England. Many times we have two-family houses as well. You can kind of see the dates on this. And these were, at the time, very much inhabited by extended families. You would have, one generation or one sibling on one floor, and that would be to another member of the extended family on another floor. You might have friends or acquaintances using these facilities. And not so, certainly the majority of three-deckers were used that way, certainly up through World War II, and I would say well beyond. And then over time, it may became more of investor properties, or you would rent out to people who you were not related to or really didn't know. So, we'll see how that plays out. And 16,000 of these were built in Boston alone. Interesting, they're facilitated, starting in the later 19th century by the development of central heating. You didn't have to rely upon your fireplace or something like that. Plumbing, internal plumbing, electricity, kind of that. Once those particular utilities became available, that's what really spurred the development of these three-family homes. So just to kind of get you to think of extended families living together in attached dwellings, and how those, I should have maybe thrown a slide or two, how we have some new examples of three-deckers. They're not, ubiquitous at this point, but in places like Somerville, kind of modern looking three-family houses. So what kind of began to change that or curb that? This is the Zoning and Tenement House Act of 1912, and people in suburbs were getting kind of worried that you had, a lot of maybe lower class people, working class people, ethnic people moving into your neighborhood, and they didn't quite like this. They were looking more for single family homes. And one of the leaders in this, in fact, the first town to adopt a restriction of the three-decker was Belmont. And the reason why was they had extended the electric trolley line out to Waverly from Harvard Square. And in fact, the Harvard Square red line from Park Street to Harvard Square wasn't opened until about 1910, 11, 12. And then you could have the electric streetcar going out from there. So all of a sudden, ooh, I don't know if you recall, there used to be a sign, I forget what it was, Harvard Square to Park Street in 12 minutes. I think it takes a lot longer now. But at the time, you could, live in Waverly in a three-family house and get to a job in downtown Boston or places in Cambridge, stuff like that. So I said, we've got to control this. So, they couldn't say, oh, you can't have three-deckers, but they said three-deckers, the state housing committee, state legislative housing committee, called them flimsy fire traps and a menace to human life because you're made with a wooden framing. And if you want to go higher than 2 stories or 2.5 stories, you had to be built of brick or stone or something like that. So fireproofing. So that was a way to control it, 2-family houses. And by the 1920s, I think the number that I've got, there were 36 communities in Massachusetts prohibiting adopting this. This was a completely local option. And a number of towns prohibited 2-family houses. And pretty much we're moving toward single unit zoning. And Boston itself, they never adopted this law, but they basically stopped building 3-deckers by the 1930s. And you had the single family home. So here we are, we're coming up the post-World War II era, and you had much more affluence. Finally, after the Depression and the privations of the 1940s, and people could move out of urban areas, whatever it is, you name it, Boston, Cambridge, Chelsea, Somerville, et cetera, these dense communities, into these more spacious suburban communities on Route 128 and beyond. And the thing, if you kind of think about it, because this was the baby boom era, in the 1950s and 60s, about 2/3 of households had children. Today, about 1/3 of households have children. So you had something different where you wanted a yard and all that, and people were really reluctant, communities were very reluctant to allow 2 or 3 family homes or attached. They wanted, and things like ADUs. In fact, ADUs were not really, it wasn't really a thing until maybe the late 70s, early 80s. Before World War II, as I said, I was showing these larger structures and, they weren't considered to be these accessory dwelling units. That's just the way they were being built. And then in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, basically, especially in suburbia, they were strictly single family homes. So then you started to kind of grow this allowance of ADUs in Newton, where I live, and an early ADU bylaw in 1987. It's had several revisions since, and they're just doing a final revision right now, we think, not a final, who knows, there may be more later, to be consistent with the new state law that's taking place right now. Now, early on, it wasn't leading to that many new units. People were just kind of feeling their way, and they probably were true in-law apartments. In fact, a lot of bylaws in towns were allowing them with rigorous special permits, and somehow family members had to be living in there, true in-laws, granny flats, if you will. At the same time, 3-deckers, which were being spurned, or people were getting away from them in the 50s and 60s, were with gentrification saying, this is not bad housing. You know, we can, and of course, they would turn them into condos. You go to places in Boston or Cambridge or Somerville, or whatever, where they've been condoized. And of course, today they're thought to be pretty good housing. And people certainly aren't tearing down three-deckers. They're renovating them, modernizing them. So just some examples here. You know, I know that Gwendolyn is showing some examples here, just attached ADUs. These are from Concord. You know, nothing, you know, these are kind of newer houses. They aren't historic houses. I've got this one to show you. I just got this off the internet. I don't know if it's from around here, but adding a basement ADU to a historic Victorian house. Looks like kind of a trick. I don't know what the cost of that would be, but you could see how it's been undertaken. And then detached ADUs, here you are, Winchester ADU above a garage. You know, they've kind of rebuilt the garage, added to a garage. And here's one from the Berkshires, Great Barrington, a detached ADU that, you know, has some historic character. And I know that Gwendolyn was talking about in historic districts, how you might design ADUs. And this is an example of, you know, you got the sloped roof, materials maybe that are consistent with the building materials of the house that exists, and not some rectangular, you know, box that is not made of the same sorts of building materials. So I just want to show you, just to think about what you could get into these ADUs, whether they're attached or detached. And as Gwendolyn pointed out, the state standard is up to 900 square feet. And here's a little layout that shows you could get a kitchen, living space, and 2 bedrooms if you want that big. That's a fair-sized unit, and certainly even an apartment building. And if you have what you could do with 600 feet, and the living includes, you know, kitchen, eating, dining, and living space, family room. So it just kind of shows you what we're talking about. So I'm just going to close here by saying that ADUs are just one piece of a housing strategy that's developed to produce 220,000 new housing units by 2035. And I just want to kind of point out, just thinking broadly, so not just about these attached to detached, you know, single household units, but this concept of the missing middle that we have. You know, we certainly know how to build single family homes, and then multifamily, you know, we're kind of working our way through. We're seeing that in a lot of communities. There are some disputes and battles on that, but that's certainly what the MBTA Communities Act is driving. But then this middle housing, which is probably definitely what's most needed, what could make tremendous contributions to more affordability. And we just have to think about it, and certainly can fit with our historic communities. And the ones that really strike me, townhouses, I think, are very important, because you know, townhouses, row houses, whatever, fourplexes, courtyard apartments, and those are maybe what we need, and can be really designed to fit in architecturally with communities. So I just kind of lay that out there. People might say, oh, Jim, you missed this point, or what about that? And if you want to do that, we can get into that in questions, because I'm just trying to kind of stimulate some thinking here. Certainly nothing that's definitive, but just how we think about housing, and housing more than one household within one structure. So that's my little presentation.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing that. Yeah, no, we're all sort of here, you know, learning together and everything. Okay, so we'll be turning it over now to VJ Joyce from the Salem Historic Commission.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. And let's see here. I'm gonna share my screen. There we go. Perfect. So everyone can see this then? Well,
hold on, it's loading.
It's loading. There we go. There we go.
There we go. Now we got it.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And thank you, everyone, for having me here. My name is VJ Joyce. I'm the chair of the Salem Historic Commission, Salem, Massachusetts, of course, as that is. And excited to just sort of tell you how we've been going through and reviewing not just ADUs, but in general, sort of our ethos around how we approach fitting new design or even renovating design, whatnot, into the historic town that is Salem, or city that is Salem. So Salem, Massachusetts has over 400 years of history. Next year in 2026, we are turning 400, but it's 400 plus because we also have to include the about, if not more than 10,000 years of native history that was here upon this site. And what I find interesting about the talk about ADUs is that regardless of what area you're talking about, ADUs have existed in Salem. They just go by another name. I think we use a term ADU. That's our modern term. That's relatively recent, but it's been something that's been happening, well, ever since the origin of Salem, as it is. A lot of it has to do, at least historically, with Salem's location. These are some cutouts of maps. They're really more just like abridged versions of full maps of Salem. I wanted to really focus on the areas, what we call the Derby Street Historic District. And each of these are sort of outlining that. It's what butts right up on the water. And when it comes to Salem, being that Salem is a peninsula, there has historically been a ton of building right on the water here. And as a result of that, you have ship captains, and you have all the workers, you have all the people that's going to support the shipping industry, as that's what Salem really sort of cut its teeth on. Even though I think of the greater population, you hear the word Salem, you think of witch trials, and yes, and of course today in pop culture that absolutely is what the case is. But I always find it fascinating as a student of architecture, especially, but also in history, in that while the city is known for the witch trials, there are only 11 buildings still standing that even witness them. So really, this city has been overturned a lot architecturally, which has led to a lot of its current eclectic mix that has been really adopted by whether they were ship captains working right here on the waterfront, or later, and this is really where we get into where the rubber hits the road for how our concern is. In the 1830s, although this map is from 1851, if you're able to, actually I can do this. This area I'm circling here was a factory that came into Salem. And that factory then caused a giant explosion of needed housing for a lot of factory workers. And so this whole Derby Street area here, and many others, would be something that see a huge boom and development from that. So to give a sense of, let's see, there we go. So these are the historic structures of Salem. Not all of them, of course. We would be here all day long although I'm more than happy to do that if you want to go through each of them. But these are sort of the prime examples, if you will, just some small selections of Salem's historic buildings that really kind of drive a lot of the development. You have everything from, you might be able to recognize it's the Corwin House, or colloquially the Witch House, which is in the top left corner there, from the 17th century. In the middle there, also on the top row, you've got a federal building on Chestnut Street. You've got the Victorian building that's known as Max's house from Hocus Pocus, as we have it there, an eclectic Victorian as it is. Another eclectic Victorian on the bottom right, this town hall in the middle, which is sort of Greek revival-ish, built in 1841. And then you have a sort of more of a vernacular Georgian home on the bottom left, which is also in the Derby Street neighborhood. All of these were generally primary structures, other than, as far as houses are concerned, except for the city hall in the middle there, built on generally undeveloped land, if you will. But with the inclusion of that factory that comes into Salem, we start to see then a lot of these neighborhoods that had been formerly inclusive of single family homes, as many of them were, but keeping in mind, as Jim very well pointed out, that they were multi-generational and you have many people of the same family living in the one household. Once they start to sort of move away, say as these areas become a bit more developed as the era comes along, these houses then will get chopped up. They will be turned into multiple housing units in one singular building. It might be known as a tenement or a boarding house, but that's generally what would occur. In many cases as well, secondary structures were updated to be rentals. So for example, this one here is right around the corner from a house. This on the left-hand side was an 18th century warehouse built in the 1750s. And in 1834, it was converted entirely into a residence. So you have the structure and you just fill it with the utilities, but 1834 utilities is, don't think of it in the way we think of it. We're not talking about running water and electricity yet, but it's really more like fireplaces for cooking and things of the sort. I would love to rent that home for $100 a year, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But next to it, you as well have on the left hand or on the right hand side, this is more what we would start to see come around once the factory comes into town. On the top, so right up here, we've got the 1851 map showing this house, the circa 1810 house, in its original location. It was described as having, in fact, what they called outhouses on its site. Now that we think about houses, we think of toilets. It's not exactly that. Think about houses as being like ancillary or secondary structures like barns, sheds, things of this sort. Jump to the map in 1938, and you'll see that over time, that quote unquote outhouse, if you will, has slowly grown and become more of its own almost unit. And that's because that's exactly what it did. That's exactly what it became. And in this 1870 home that I have right next to it, showing the house on its site, that was built in order to accommodate a lot of the factory workers that were coming in. And so in this case, they plopped it right in front of their front door, which is kind of wild, but it's what they were willing to do to create a residence and some extra income off of this. So with that, should just talk a little bit about our historic districts. This is when we're talking about this Salem Historic Districts Commission. These are the districts that we are overseeing, specifically the ones dictated on the map on the left here. So ultimately, you've got you've got the Salem Common Historic District, you got the Derby Street Historic District, you got the Lafayette Street, South Salem / Historic District, and the largest of them all, which is the McIntyre Historic District. All of these are, we're determined to sort of have a lot of the major architectural features that make Salem so characteristic. On the right-hand side, you have the National Register properties, or districts, I should say, and that is much wider. It encompasses a much larger portion of the architecture of Salem, but our review on the Historic District Commission doesn't encompass all of the buildings that would be within that as well, to an extent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's see, this is where over 600 buildings are a part of it also, a lot of responsibility there. Now, how is it that, if you will, how is it that, what is it that we do when what we consider as a commission when someone comes to us with an application? Well, in many ways, it has a lot to do with the context. Context around architecture is everything, especially within a very eclectic mix of architectural styles that Salem has. And so a lot of what we're dictated by is, as I've highlighted here, it's as far as additions and expansions to existing buildings go, having a lot to do with the relation of the features, proposed features, I should say, to what the features of the existing building are, or on the site that you're adding to, or their relationship to the features of the buildings around them. And when I say features, it can be everything from roof line, it can be window pattern, window styles, siding types, all of this kind of stuff is when we say features, it's really architectural features in a grand way. And then new construction has, in a similar way, it's also taking into consideration the relation of the size of the addition or new construction onto, in relation to the size of the buildings around it. All of it is sort of making it so that there is a cohesive sense of development there. And that has everything to do with, just being really well versed in the knowledge and the styles of the houses in the area that the property would be in. This is as well where we get, as we have here, we have our guidelines, which we are very lucky to have, something that we just recently updated in 2022, which means that we are going to have to work on updating it to align with this current ordinance about the ADUs. But this is a great jumping off point, as it gives us a lot of good understanding of, well, in this case, we pulled out 2 pages showing additions to existing buildings, what it is that we take a look at, and as well new accessory buildings, also something, and how we determine that. Scale and massing is a big one. Respect the character defining height of, say, the principal building on the site, because of course you have to consider when you're building let's say, an addition on the back of a home that was built in 1750, to have that addition, and because we're talking about appropriateness here, what would have been appropriate for an addition to that structure, say, at that time? Well, it's likely not going to be an addition that overshadows and overtakes the original house, in a sense. It's not going to be, the original house there is not going to be sort of secondary to this new addition as it sort of overtakes it and everything else. So how is that done? And that's really where, in this amazingly historic area of historic city of Salem, we have a lot of precedents that we can look to how that might how that might help. We also have a demolition delay ordinance here, something that was recently updated to allow for greater effectiveness. Before, it was just under a 6-month demolition delay, and for some structures now we can go up to 18 months. And what that allows for is it is a delay on demolition. So ultimately, after waiting out that waiting period, a demolition could go forward. But the idea of the delay is to find solutions to preserve the structure as might be, or have whatever is going to happen to the structure, because generally it's never a full-on demolition. More often than not, it's a big addition that takes over things that trigger demolition, which I have written out here. Things like 50% of, and exterior walls of a building, roof structures, all this kind of stuff. If you destroy 50% of a roof of a house, well, a lot of that character of that home then, or one of the big features of the character defining elements of that home is lost. So we have this example here of a home that was on the water in this oceanfront community called the Willows here from the 1850s. This incredibly eclectic Victorian home, which, like the rest of the houses in that area, are also it's a very, very fascinating structure. But this was something where they, were raising it up to meet, flood elevation and flood protection. And then, of course, they expanded a little bit on the back in order to sort of create more livable space for themselves. And while what's interesting is that the final photo, while not on here, is very similar to the origin photo, and that was kind of the whole beauty of it. And that's kind of why we have this demo delay, is to allow for those solutions to be worked through. Take some time to pause, if you will, to really think through the what it is that this new structure and how it's going to look will impact the area and what was there before. Because while construction these days sees buildings go up in a matter of months, if foreseeably they're going to be there for the foreseeable future. And that is something that we absolutely have to consider when it comes to the longevity and the impact of what we do to our current built environment. So moving on now to the examples of the accessory dwellings units in Salem. Carriage houses are pretty common around here, given in the area, in the historic district areas that we are covering, I should say, that are our purview under the SHC, Salem Historic Commission, is that a lot of these houses, like on Chestnut Street within the McIntyre district, or even in some cases around the Salem Common, Washington Square, these grand, usually Victorian homes, but mainly from the late 18th, early 19th centuries, they have carriage houses because, that's the garages of the day. They don't have cars, but they have carriages, and carriages are, towed by horses. And so horses need their own, utilities and things of the sort. So you have these separate structures that lend themselves very well later on, as in like today and in the 20th century, to be converted into residences. In fact, more often than not, the upper levels of these carriage houses were a residence, if in fact for maybe the footman or the driver, things of the sort. Or in other cases, like in the image of this structure here, that door that's just very poorly circled, that is ultimately that would have been a space to bring hay up so you can have some food for the horses, things of this sort. So these are some of the really relatively easy ones that have that can be easily converted without making too large of an impact, if you will, on the current built environment, because they're already their own structures. And the beauty of having these carriage houses having been built roughly around the same time as the main structures themselves, the architecture is almost identical. The carriage houses, secondary structures, ancillary structures, whatever you might want to call them, they would take the style of the house, because when these properties, when I mean properties, I don't just mean a home singularly, but properties as in any structure on a site, is generally going to have been built as a holistic thing. And by that, I mean a singular style sort of working its way all across. Of course, there are later examples of people with an 18th century home putting in a 20th century garage, but sort of fewer and far between. And when it comes to things like that, that's as well where context and other examples come into play. So moving on to the next one, we have, so these are carriage house conversions. So they were carriage houses that never really fully supported any sense of livability, if you will. You can probably tell these carriage houses originally started off much smaller than what the previous carriage houses that we had seen. Just to flip back there for a sec. And so these would, need to be converted almost wholly, if you will, into residential use, and that's exactly what these have done. I mean, a lot of the windows themselves, like for example, this carriage house on the left, looks pretty fancy and ornate, but that's what it was for someone's carriage and their horse. Those windows and whatnot were not necessarily, I mean, the actual windows themselves might have been a bit redone, but the style of them is purely in the 19th century there. A very nice sort of Italianate carriage house as you have it. And so these would be, these were under the previous zoning bonus for the historically appropriate carriage house conversions as we have them. And then this one here is a garage conversion. So this is 20th century, and someone, in this case, this is in the Bridge Street Neck Historic District, which is part of the national. This is part of the national review, but it is not under our purview, except that because this garage was having more than 50% of its roof demolished, it came under us under the demo delay. So that's how we were able to review this one and sort of guide them along to create an ADU that was, of course, going to be somewhat modern, as we're not trying to make it look like a copy of the house that it's coming off of, but it's about being appropriate in a way. And so, this is where we look to the main house, which is, you can't tell in this photo, but it is a 3-story federal sort of rectangular home. And it lent itself in a way to sort of the modern-ish design that they were looking to go with for their carriage house, or for their ADU that was their 1920s cinder block garage. And so there's we played around with things like the window grill patterns and things of the sort, but trying to match it up, and it's supposed to going to be looking really nice. Can't wait to see that. And then as well, we have the attic conversions of ADUs. A lot of these structures, this one, if you can believe it, single family home, even was back in the 1850s when it was first built. You can kind of see how big it actually was, or how small, I guess, it actually was. It was just that deep. In fact, these drawings that I'm drawing on here on the right, they've actually raised the roof up a little bit, which allowed for them to put more of a full height second story in there. And how would they do that? Well, that's where we look to, what would have been done on such a structure back in the day. They were talking about putting dormers on and such like that. And this is a solution that we had come to. But, how do you maintain the existing language of the architecture while, of course, fitting in the modern, fully modern way of life? And that's kind of, that's the purview, and that's the goal really of the Salem Historic Commission here. And then, of course, we got the building addition. So, you can convert a building, work with an existing building, or in this case, add additions onto it. And again, luckily, like Salem with its carriage houses, they've had these large mansions that needed all these service wings. So this house that you see here, this yellow house, is on Chestnut Street. It was actually the very first house built on Chestnut Street in 1801. And the original structure, when I say original structure, I mean the structure that was built for sort of the main occupants of the home is sort of what's in front. So the furthest thing that you see from us here in this image. What you see behind this taller structure here than the shorter one were later additions. Later, likely, if not to house servants, if not that, it would have been kitchen and utility use, things of that sort, which in the 20th century, when you're, moving from multi-generational housing to single, family housing in that way, it's just, so much more space than is actually needed. And this is something where it's easily able to fit in, if you will, onto what's currently existing. Now, of course, it's not always going to be like that. This one is another example of what the previous example, it's an existing building addition. This is where, you know, they were easily able to convert what was a utility wing, if you will, into, I think they expanded it slightly, but for the most part, it maintained the original dimensional points of the original structure that they built off of. A little bit more than $100 a month, but maybe that's you know, adjusted for inflation there. And then we have, of course, the ADUs in Salem. And so this is where what we've heard already, especially I know Gwendolyn did a really good job of talking through it, showing how the, you know, ADUs in Salem specifically, we've just, you know, adjusted it slightly in a way now, 900 square feet or 50% of the house, the size of the house, whichever is smaller. So this is something important. Oh, and then of course a minimum of 350 square feet per health code. And this is where it has a lot to do with the availability of the structures in Salem, and as well considering that we have a very tight and dense architecture in here. And by that I mean, you know, the house lots are real close together. You'll see that in a second. And so that is where a lot of these square footage calculations come to help accommodate. This is one that is not in a local historic district, and they didn't tear away enough of the existing building to trigger the demolition delay. By that I mean they didn't remove more than 50% of an exterior wall, of a roof, or anything of the sort. And so this is one that that was ultimately just allowed by right, and this is what they've added on. And ultimately, you know, it's ancillary to the structure. By that I mean it's secondary to the main structure. It doesn't take it over. It doesn't look like there's two big houses trying to compete on the same lot. And that's kind of the idea behind a lot of those size restrictions. It's in a way to keep the language of the street the same without making this look like a, you know, 5-story structure with 2-story details on it. You know, because that just, you know, wouldn't be in a way appropriate there. And then finally, this has been kind of covered already very well, in fact, by Gwendolyn. And so I won't go too much over it, but what we need to do as a local historic commission here in Salem is getting of course, a better understanding, as it says here, of the State Affordable Homes Act, and as well, how do we fit that in and plug that into our usual business as usual within the districts, and our review and all of that, and how all of it gets processed in a way. So that's, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Patty Kelleher is a preservation planner. I am the sort of, if you will, I mean, I'm the chair of the Historic Commission, but Patty's really the one that if you want the information and the details, and if you, I mean, specifically, if you want the documents, Patty will be more than happy to send that to you. But of course, I'm equally more than happy to answer questions here on the chat, and anytime in the future, you can always contact her to get my contact. So thank you very much.
Thank you, VJ, for that. We really, really appreciate it. We're now going to turn to our question portion. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Scott, to introduce herself and to kick off the questions.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Scott, and I am a senior regional land use and historic preservation planner at MAPC. I've been doing my best to track down all of your questions as the speakers have been presenting, and I've tried to compile them by topic. But if I don't quite get to your question or to the crux of your question, feel free to just, you know, raise your hand in the Zoom function or write in the chat. So Gwendolyn, I was wondering if I could ask you a question first. I think there were a couple questions that came in the chat that were asking about the distinction between protected use and non-protected use accessory dwelling units. Could you just kind of reiterate what the distinction is between those two things, and then specifically how that applies to the law and the regulations, and specifically around local historic districts?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is sort of the crux of understanding the new ADU law, and it's very confusing that the state added this new definition. So protected use ADU is the type of ADU that the state is requiring municipalities to allow by right. And it is within that definition that we were looking at, the up to 900 square feet or half of the gross floor area. those parking requirements, all of those sort of things are wrapped up together to be the protected use ADU. And the way the state allows it by right means that every lot with a principal dwelling within a single family residential zoning district has the right to build a protected use ADU. Municipalities are allowed, so every municipality has to have that exact protected use ADU allowed by right. You're also allowed to have additional types of ADUs that are outside that definition. There are much fewer restrictions on those. Once you're allowing that protected use ADU, it's sort of up to you if you want to allow additional, like, for example, those larger ADUs is the main thing that people are usually interested in. You can allow those. And you have much more freedom in how you regulate them. So the protected use ADU in historic districts has to have that measurable and objective design standards only. If you have a local ADU as well, those you can apply more restrictive design standards to. It's up to you how you want to regulate. But I also want to note that because, as I mentioned, you have to allow by right this protected use ADU on every lot that qualifies. If you allow, we've been calling them local ADU types because they'd be designed or defined by municipality. So if you have a local ADU type, let's say that allows up to 1,200 square feet or even larger. If a lot has a 1,200 square foot ADU on it that the municipality has approved, you still have to allow by right that protected use ADU on that same lot. So if you have that local ADU as well, then you're moving into a situation where you are essentially, you might be allowing 2 ADUs per lot because every lot has that allowance for the protected use ADU. So that's sort of a key thing to note with the local ADUs is that you're not changing the definition. It's in addition to everything that the state is requiring you to allow. Hopefully that clears things up a little bit. And I can also drop my email in the chat. It's definitely a confusing thing, and I'm happy to answer more, like go into that more depth and over email if people are still confused.
Thank you. That was really helpful. VJ and possibly Patty, if she's interested in in answering. We had a couple questions around local historic districts and how your guidelines or your reviews are treating ADUs. And Gwendolyn, you might have some insight on this as well, just in terms of the state regulations. So do the local historic district guidelines for ADUs have to meet a different or possibly higher standard than what's currently required under 40C? And a related question is, if existing local historic district guidelines don't really meet the like objective quantifiable standard, then like would an applicant be able to just bypass local historic district review? Like do the standards essentially become null and void? And I know that this is all very new territory.
Right, no, of course, yeah. To the latter point, that's a very good question about the superseding, if you will, the local historic district requirements. That I think that's one of those things that we had mentioned we're still working on. How do we work that in? But Patty might be able to give a better sense to that. As far as the first of the 2 questions go, when we review these applications as they come through the local historic district, they would be reviewed under the local historic district guidelines. So that is something that we then, they want to do an ADU, they can do so by right, but their house and their property is also within the local historic district that we are reviewing. So as a result, it's almost like a, an additional level in that way to meet based upon, it's sort of that appropriateness standard in that sense. Patty, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think I would just add that, as has been said, this is a very new state guidance that I think, hasn't certainly been tested as far as local historic district review goes, but I would say that I don't envision any different review process by the historical commission than what they have undertaken previously for any type of conversion for an additional dwelling unit in a locally designated building. I think it would be similar to the solar array. The historical commission reviews solar arrays with a understanding that that's encouraged by the state, but it still goes through the historic district review. So I envision it that same process as what's been done previously.
I might just add in too that I'm not as clear on the answer to the first part of the question, but in terms of bypassing local historic district review, my understanding is that at least in terms of the measurable and objective standards, what would happen is everything that's included in the local historic district review would need to be looked at, and if there was a standard that was not measurable and objective, it would not apply to an ADU. But the standards that are in there that are measurable and objective would apply. So it sort of would be a picking and choosing of what fits in that category, and that would be applied to the protected use ADU.
Yeah, it looks like we have a few related questions just kind of around that interplay of 40A and 40C. And so it sounds like part of the answer is we're figuring it out.
One of the things that it brings up something that, of course, is kind of, how we've been doing it one way in a way when it comes to how do you think about a design holistically within an area that is so eclectic. And I'm thinking about from the Salem perspective, just because that's where I'm at. And so, how do you meet that objective versus subjective guidelines when each style of home could impart its own style on the, of the ADU that you might be trying to get. How do you adjust for that? That's something I think we're going to be working on for sure.
And Gwendolyn, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of my understanding from the regulations was that you're essentially not allowed to apply stricter reviews to ADUs than you would for a single family house or something in that realm. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Emma, you can jump in if you want to add on at all. But yeah, that's sort of correct for within the same zoning district. So as it applies to an within the same local historic district. So whatever design guidelines or design standards are applied to a primary dwelling within that same historic district, you can't have them be more restrictive on an ADU in that same historic district. But the way the regulations are phrased, it's a little confusing because you can apply design standards that are more strict to the ADU than for a primary dwelling in the same zoning district that is outside of the historic district, if that makes sense. And that's how they're phrasing it. So I just want to know that.
We also have Emma Battaglia with us, who's a senior housing planner. Emma, was there anything that you wanted to clarify either in the chat or from what we've talked about so far? You are also on mute.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to clarify that there is a pretty explicit difference between design guidelines and design standards. So design standards is really what would be, generally that lives like in your zoning ordinance and not necessarily in your historic district guidelines. And then design guidelines are an optional thing that are allowed, but you wouldn't be able to mandate adherence to them because the guidelines, just by nature of how they are kind of structured, are pretty subjective.
And Emma, we just got a question in the chat about the relationship to the different types of units within a district. So would you be able to answer that?
Yes, sure. So, yes, so it essentially, the idea is that every lot, like with a residential unit on it in a zoning district where single family is allowed, would have to allow one protected use ADU. And so that's not, if you have a multi-unit dwelling on the lot, it doesn't mean that each of those dwellings within the multi-unit building would be allowed an ADU. The entire multi-unit building would be allowed one ADU. So if you have like a 3-unit building, that entire building would be the primary or the principal as far as like the relation between that building and the ADU. And then and kind of the same thing, like if there was a townhouse, if there was mixed use, that would still count. But again, it's just the residential portion that would get the ADU, the protected use ADU. I also saw a comment around the gross square or the gross floor area. Sure. So I understand where the confusion is coming from. The reason why we kind of kept the 900 square feet in there is because that is how the protected use ADUs and ADUs in general are defined in the regulations, which is also kind of how they're defined in the statute. So that's somewhat of a barrier we were working with. But because of the interpretation by the Attorney General's office and other lawyers that we've been working with, that a more permissive ADU type would be allowed as long as it is still has all the other qualifications that would make it a protected use ADU. Like you couldn't mandate where on the the relation between location and the principal dwelling. But if you wanted to have larger, if that's the only difference between that and the 900 square foot, you would be allowed to do that because that is considered more permissive. So,
So Emma, what I'm hearing you say is that you can't necessarily have a 1-for-1 where, for example, you take the protected use ADU and you say, well, we'll actually let you have it be larger, but we're going to restrict it in other ways. Like at that point, you're kind of out of bounds.
Right. So you wouldn't be able to do that. If you wanted to have an option for a kind of ADU that has more restrictions, you could have that be kind of like a local type of ADU, but that would be different from the protected use ADU because it's pretty explicit how that has to be regulated.
So Danielle, I hope that answers your question. But if not, feel free to connect with Emma. And larger in GFA and also larger than 50%. That's what I'm unclear on. So maybe Danielle, I'll have you connect with Emma and Gwendolyn about that. Because I think that that's a good question just generally about how to interpret the guidelines. I just wanted to turn to another question in the chat, more specifically about historic districts, which I think is a good point that that Charlie Sullivan is making, which maybe Vijay and Patty, you can speak to a little bit, which is that there's kind of perhaps a different level of professionalism, perhaps, that these guidelines could be requiring of communities when it comes to local historic districts or historical commission reviews. Curious about your thoughts on, and again, I know that Salem is a little bit of an outlier there, but just how maybe communities with like less capacity, whether that means that they don't have staff, or maybe they have kind of like a volunteer commission that doesn't have the type of training or expertise that you do, can really try to make a good faith effort to protect the historic character of the communities that they love while also implementing this this new state law?
Hmm.
I know it's a big
Yeah.
question.
It's a good question though. I do think that the 40C guidelines, they provide something. I think that's sort of where Salem kind of takes it and runs a little bit further with it, is that they have then applied their own standard sort of in addition to. So that's kind of one of those, you know, that's the thing, you know, Salem, yes, we're lucky for that. And we'd hope that we would be a, if you will, a lighthouse or a beacon as a way to say this is how it, you know, it could be done type of a thing. But there, you know, that's really where it comes down to, you know, you're looking at sort of how something fits within the greater context, if you will. So as a result of that, that's really where it's about knowing your local, you know, the local architecture, the local area, you know, how something would fit within, you know, contextually with that, you know, forms and shapes, things of that sort. Let's see here. I'm trying to see if trying to find the language that I have in my head. I want to make it have it. I want to make sure I have it right. But yeah, it's ultimately yeah, based around sort of, you know, the knowledge of the area combined with what's been handed off under the 40C regulations. And then of course, if the town or city has a want to increase that, you know, like Salem has, and that's really where you know, it was able to do so. Now it did that in the 70s in the face of urban renewal. So, you know, it certainly might be more robust than others if they got started right now. But I think in this where, you know, this is where I also like to tag team with Patty when it comes to these questions, because she's really good about that as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what more to add. I think was Emma who said the standards versus guidelines was very thought-provoking for me, certainly. And I wonder a couple of things. One is if the communities take a look at maybe previous applications that provide some guidance on how to address, you know, future applications that would be adding maybe a new doorway or converting an outbuilding or new construction, and kind of use that previous decision to create some standards moving forward. But I also think too with MAPC, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to provide like an overall guidance for local historic district commissions with a set of standards to consider in this type of review. Those are my just initial thoughts, but this is also new that I think we're all learning together here.
And I think that we are hoping as well that if folks have questions, that you'll reach out to Lindsay and Jeff and Michael, who lead the coalition, so that we can continue to be a resource for all of you going forward. I think we'll just end with one more question, which is from Teresa, who's asking about how communities might be supporting or thinking about supporting ADUs in local historic districts using CPA funds. And so looking at the kind of twinned uses of CPA to support both housing and historic preservation goals. I'm curious if Gwendolyn, Emma, BJ, Patty, any of you have thoughts on this? Maybe Emma and Gwendolyn, if you know of any work that communities have done kind of in general to support ADU adoption or production.
I mean, some communities are definitely starting to update their regulations right now. I don't know if we have a great example of like where the regs have been updated and we've seen kind of it all play out.
Yeah. So maybe we do this webinar in a year.
Yeah.
we have some more answers for folks.
Thing I just want to mention, because I
Yeah.
see it kind of coming up. The whole idea with the way the regulations are structured, both in terms of the historic districts, but all the other characteristics, like whether or not it goes through site plan review, the way the dimensional standards are structured, you essentially can't use any of those things to not allow an ADU. So, you know, I think what in the context of your historic district commission, what you would really want to do is like have that be kind of a collaborative process where you're able to work with the applicant to get to, you know, a design that kind of works for everybody. And, you know, in terms of process, like, unfortunately, a lot of this is going to have to just play out in the courts, because it's basically up to your zoning enforcement officer to make a case by case determination, if you know, it can be allowed. So in the event that the zoning enforcement officer says it's not, then that applicant would potentially have, you know, grounds for legal action. And depending on how that goes is my understanding how more regulations may fill out. And in terms of unreasonable, I think it's that whole Dover analysis that's in the regs, so I'm not really going to go into that too much because I could talk for that for a while. But you know, anything that would be unreasonable is basically anything that is not serving a public purpose, or it might be serving a public purpose, but it would cost so much that would basically render the creation of an ADU infeasible. So the idea is like you can set standards, and you can allow guidelines, but you just can't use those to effectively prevent the creation of an ADU.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. I know that there's a lot of questions that folks have. And Gwendolyn and Emma certainly can be resources for the nuts and bolts of the ADU law. Lindsay, I can turn it back over to you to wrap things up.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to Gwendolyn, Jim, and VJ for talking to us, and for all of you who were able to join us today. Glad that we could start this important conversation and be in community with each other as we work through the implications of this law. And again, we'll be posting this recording of this webinar and sharing the links in a follow-up email. And so again, just thank you, everyone. And again, you can reach out to all of us here at MAPC, and we will work hard to get you the answers that you have, and everything. So have a great day.
Thank you all. Appreciate it very much.
Bye.